At 7:30 a.m. on December 24, 1914, Private Thomas Hartley huddled in a muddy trench near Ypres, Belgium, facing approximately 200 German soldiers 100 meters across the frozen no-man's land, while a dense fog blanketed the battlefield and the bitter cold bit through woolen uniforms. Despite the looming danger, Hartley noticed flickers of light and movement in enemy trenches, tiny signals of a shared, quiet hope for respite from the endless gunfire. German machine guns and artillery could open fire in seconds if any unusual movement was detected, while fellow Allied units were stationed hundreds of meters away, unable to intervene. Within the next hour, an extraordinary pause would ripple across the trenches, and humanity would briefly overpower hostility. It was a moment proving that courage on the battlefield was not always measured by weapons or ranks, but by the will to embrace common humanity, even in war. The fog came first, thick and gray, rolling across the Belgian countryside like a funeral shroud. It settled into the trenches at dawn, muffling sound, obscuring vision, transforming the Western Front into a landscape of ghosts. Private Thomas Hartley pressed his back against the muddy wall of the trench, rifle across his knees, hands numb despite the woolen gloves his mother had sent 3 weeks prior. The gloves were already falling apart, frayed at the fingertips, crusted with dried mud that no amount of scraping could fully remove. Around him, the trench stretched in both directions, a serpentine scar carved into the earth. Wooden duckboards, slick with ice and filth, lined the bottom, but they did little to keep boots dry. Water seeped constantly from the walls, pooling in low spots, freezing overnight into treacherous patches. The smell was inescapable: wet earth, unwashed bodies, latrine pits dug too close, the metallic tang of spent ammunition, and beneath it all, something sweet and rotten that no one wanted to identify. Hartley shifted his weight, trying to ease the ache in his lower back. He'd been on watch since 5, and the cold had settled into his bones with the patient inevitability of winter itself. Beside him, Corporal Davies slept sitting up, head tilted back, mouth open, breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Further down, men huddled in small groups, speaking in low murmurs, or sat alone, staring at nothing, conserving what little warmth their bodies could generate. It was Christmas Eve. The thought arrived unbidden, unwelcome. Back home in Manchester, his sisters would be decorating the parlor, his mother baking mince pies, his father reading by the fire. The images felt like memories from someone else's life, impossibly distant, separated from this frozen hell by more than miles or months. War had a way of making the past feel fictional, as though normal life had never truly existed. Yet something was different this morning. Hartley couldn't quite name it, but he felt it in the quality of the silence, in the way the usual pre-dawn tension seemed to have softened. The German lines, usually marked by occasional movement or the glint of morning light on metal, appeared quiet, too quiet. Suspicion warred with curiosity in his chest. At 06:15, the first artillery barrage should have started, the daily routine of shells lobbed back and forth, more out of habit than strategy. But the morning remained still. Hartley glanced at Davies, who had woken and was now frowning at his pocket watch as though the mechanism had failed. "They're late," Davies muttered. "Maybe they're sleeping in," Private Jenkins suggested from nearby, attempting levity that fell flat in the cold air. "Don't be daft," Davies replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Then around 07:00, Hartley saw it, a flicker of light in the German trench, maybe 80 meters across no man's land. Then another, small, steady flames that didn't move like rifle fire or signal flares. Candles, perhaps, or small lanterns. He watched, transfixed, as more lights appeared, dotting the enemy line like stars emerging at dusk. "What are they doing?" Jenkins whispered, crawling closer to peer over the sandbags. "Get down, you fool," Davies hissed, but he too was watching, rifle at the ready but not raised. The lights multiplied, 10, 15, 20 tiny flames dancing in the gray morning, and then carried on the wind came something even stranger, singing, faint at first, almost imagined but growing clearer. German words unfamiliar, but the melody, Hartley knew that melody. "Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht." Silent night, they were singing Silent Night. The sound rippled along the British trench, men stirring, climbing to their feet, drawn by the impossible novelty of music where there should be gunfire. Some crossed themselves. Others simply stared, mouths open, trying to reconcile the enemy with the carol, the war with Christmas. Hartley felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there since September. He didn't know what would happen next, whether this was some elaborate German trick, whether officers would arrive and order them to fire, whether the singing would stop and the shelling would begin. But in that moment, listening to Silent Night drift across the frozen wasteland between the trenches, He allowed himself the smallest, most dangerous thing a soldier could feel: a hope. Private Thomas Hartley was 22 years old, though the war had aged him. Before August 1914, he'd worked at his father's textile mill in Manchester, operating looms, learning the business he'd someday inherit. He'd had a girlfriend, Mary, who wrote him letters that arrived irregularly, sometimes 3 at once, sometimes none for weeks. Her most recent letter, received 5 days ago, mentioned that she'd started volunteering at a hospital, rolling bandages, preparing care packages. She'd asked if he needed anything. He'd laughed at that, a bitter sound that surprised him. What did he need? Dry socks, a hot meal, sleep without dreams, to go home, but he'd written back that he was fine, that she shouldn't worry. Hartley had enlisted in September with 3 friends from the mill. They'd believed the recruiting posters, the promises that it would be an adventure, that they'd be home by Christmas. Of the 4, only he remained. William died at 1st Ypres in October, caught by machine gun fire during an advance that gained them 40 meters of mud. Robert lost his leg to shrapnel 3 weeks later, evacuated home to an uncertain future. And James simply vanished one night during a bombardment, either buried alive or blown to pieces so small that no body could be recovered. Hartley tried not to think about which fate was worse. Corporal William Davies, at 31, was one of the older men in the company. He'd been a policeman in Cardiff before the war, married with 2 young daughters he spoke about constantly. Elizabeth was 7, Catherine was 5, and Davies carried their photograph in a leather wallet he kept in his breast pocket, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the damp. He read their letters aloud sometimes in the evenings, his Welsh accent growing thicker with emotion as he described their school lessons, their games, the cat that had adopted them. The other men tolerated this ritual, even found comfort in it. Davies' daughters were a reminder that somewhere life continued normally. Davies was steady, competent, the sort of NCO who kept men alive through attention to detail and refusal to panic. He checked their rifles, their rations, their feet for signs of trench foot. He knew when to push and when to let them rest. He'd been decorated after Mons for holding a position when his lieutenant was killed, keeping the men organized during a chaotic retreat. But he never mentioned the medal, had sent it home to his wife in a package with a brief note saying she should keep it safe for the girls. Private Robert Jenkins was 19, a farm boy from Somerset who'd never been more than 10 miles from home before joining up. He was big, strong from years of physical labor, but possessed a gentle temperament that made him popular in the platoon. He didn't complain about the mud, the cold, the fear. He simply endured, the way he'd endured hard winters and failed harvests and all the other challenges of rural life. His letters home were full of lies. He told his mother the food was good, the officers' fare, the French countryside beautiful. He never mentioned the rats, some as large as cats, that fought over corpses in no man's land. Never mentioned the constant diarrhea that plagued half the company. Never mentioned the night he'd stabbed a German soldier in hand-to-hand fighting, how the man's blood had been hot on his hands, how his eyes had looked surprised. Jenkins had a ritual. Every morning he read a page from a small Bible his mother had given him, even when he was too exhausted to absorb the words. It was a talisman, a connection to home, to the person he'd been before. Some men teased him for it, but gently, without real cruelty. The war hadn't yet made them cruel. Across no man's land in the German trenches, Obergefreiter Friedrich Weber faced similar conditions. At 25, he'd been a schoolteacher in Munich, instructing 10-year-olds in mathematics and history. He'd loved his work, had planned to marry his sweetheart Anna in the spring of 1915. Those plans now seemed laughably naive. He didn't know if there would be a spring, or if he'd live to see it, or if Anna would still want him after what he'd become. Weber was thoughtful, introspective, keeping a diary when he could find moments of privacy and scraps of paper. He wrote about the absurdity of war, the waste of it, but also about the strange bonds that formed between men facing death together. He wrote about the soldier in the next trench section, a butcher from Hamburg who sang opera surprisingly well. About the officer Lieutenant Hoffmann, who treated his men fairly and shared his tobacco. About the Austrian soldier, barely 18, who cried at night when he thought no one could hear. The German trenches were no better than the British ones. The same mud, the same cold, the same fear. Weber's feet were constantly wet, painful with the early stages of trench foot. He'd watched men lose toes, entire feet to frostbite and infection. He'd seen men go mad from the artillery bombardments, screaming until they were sedated or simply staring into space, unreachable. The German army had promised glory and victory. They delivered mud and death. Gefreiter Hans Müller, a baker's son from Berlin, occupied the trench section directly opposite Hartley's position, though neither knew the other existed. Müller was 20, cheerful by nature, though the war had dimmed that cheer considerably. He joined up with enthusiasm, believing in the Kaiser, in Germany's righteous cause, in the adventure of military service. 4 months of reality had complicated those beliefs. He still served, still followed orders, but the certainty had gone, replaced by something more ambiguous and troubling. Mueller missed bread. It was a small thing, ridiculous to think about given the larger horror, but he dreamed about his father's bakery, about the smell of fresh loaves in the morning, about kneading dough, about the simple satisfaction of work well done. The army bread was terrible, dense, moldy, often more sawdust than flour. He missed his mother's cooking, his sister's laughter, his father's bad jokes. He missed ordinary life with an ache that sometimes overwhelmed him. These men, Hartley, Davies, Jenkins, Weber, Mueller, and thousands like them, were not heroes or villains. They were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, trying to survive each day, finding small comforts where they could. They wrote letters, shared cigarettes, told stories, gambled with worthless coins, complained about officers, and clung to routines that gave shape to the chaos. They were tired, cold, frightened, and far from home. And on Christmas Eve 1914, they were about to do something remarkable. By December 1914, the Western Front had crystallized into a nightmare of modern warfare that no military theorist had predicted and no soldier had prepared for. What began in August as a war of movement, armies marching, flanking, advancing, had by autumn devolved into a static siege that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Over 400 miles of trenches scarred the landscape, opposing lines sometimes separated by mere yards, sometimes by several hundred meters, but always close enough that men could hear the enemy coughing, talking, living their parallel existence in the mud. The Battle of Ypres in October and November had been particularly brutal. British, French, and Belgian forces held the salient against German attempts to break through to the Channel ports. Casualties on both sides were staggering. The British lost over 50,000 men, the French over 50,000, and the Germans over 130,000. These weren't just numbers. They were schoolteachers and farmers, bakers and policemen, entire villages worth of young men, ground into the mud for gains measured in meters. The tactical situation near Ypres, where Hartley's unit was stationed, epitomized the stalemate. Both sides had dug extensive trench systems. Frontline trenches facing the enemy, support trenches behind them, reserve trenches further back, all connected by communication trenches that zigzagged to limit damage from enfilade fire. Barbed wire entanglements some 20 feet deep fronted the positions. Machine guns, positioned every 50 to 100 meters, could sweep no man's land with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery pieces, ranging from small field guns to massive siege mortars, stood ready to pummel any position that showed activity. The technology of warfare had outpaced the tactics. Soldiers charged with rifles and bayonets into machine gun fire that could cut down hundreds in minutes. Artillery barrages that were supposed to destroy enemy positions instead churned the ground into impassable moonscapes. Barbed wire that was supposed to be destroyed by shelling often remained intact, channeling attackers into killing zones. Generals trained in 19th century warfare struggled to adapt to 20th century weapons. The result was slaughter on an industrial scale. The German army occupying the positions opposite Hartley's unit consisted primarily of reserve formations and landwehr troops, older soldiers, many in their 30s and 40s, who'd completed their initial service years earlier and been recalled. These were not the elite formations that had driven through Belgium in August. Those units had been bled white in the autumn fighting. These were shopkeepers and clerks, fathers and husbands, men who remembered the last war against France in 1870 and hoped this one would follow a similar script. A quick victory, home by Christmas. They'd been disappointed. German defensive doctrine emphasized machine gun emplacements and coordinated artillery fire. Their trenches were generally better constructed than Allied ones, featuring deeper dugouts with wooden reinforcement, drainage systems, even rudimentary furniture. This reflected Germany's expectation that they'd hold these positions through the winter before resuming offensive operations in spring. They'd brought Christmas trees, candles, and decorations from home, attempting to maintain morale during what everyone hoped would be the war's final Christmas. Supply problems plagued both sides. The British logistics system, never designed for a continental war of this scale, struggled to deliver adequate food, ammunition, and winter clothing to frontline units. Men often received emergency rations, hard biscuits, tinned beef for days at a stretch. Fresh bread was a luxury. Hot food required field kitchens in the rear, with food carried forward in containers that arrived lukewarm at best, frozen at worst. Tea was the universal comfort, brewed constantly, shared generously, the one taste of normalcy in an abnormal world. The Germans faced similar challenges, exacerbated by the British naval blockade that was beginning to strangle imports. Their army rations relied heavily on preserved meats, dried vegetables, and the infamous army bread that Müller so despised. Coffee was available but of terrible quality. Tobacco, at least, remained plentiful, and both sides engaged in regular truces of necessity to allow burial parties to recover dead from no man's land, during which soldiers sometimes traded cigarettes or tobacco across the lines. Weather added another enemy. December 1914 was cold and wet with temperatures hovering around freezing. The trenches, hastily dug and poorly drained, filled with water that had no place to go. Men stood in mud and water for hours, sometimes days, developing trench foot, a condition where cold, wet feet lost circulation, tissue died, infections set in. Severe cases required amputation. The cold also made weapons malfunction, turned leather rigid, made metal painful to touch with bare hands. Artillery bombardments followed predictable patterns, almost ritualized. Morning bombardments at dawn, evening bombardments at dusk, occasional nighttime harassment fire to prevent sleep. The purpose was less to cause casualties, though they certainly did, than to maintain pressure to prevent the enemy from feeling safe, to erode morale. Soldiers learned to identify shells by sound, the whistle of field guns, the deeper roar of howitzers, the freight train rumble of heavy siege mortars. They learned to gauge distance and trajectory, to judge whether to take cover or remain in place. This education came at a cost, paid in blood by those who learned too slowly. Snipers added constant danger. Showing your head above the trench line for more than a few seconds invited a bullet from an enemy marksman perhaps 200 meters away, hidden, patient, waiting. Both sides employed skilled shooters who knew their ranges, who understood wind and light, who could hit a target the size of a man's head at distances that seemed impossible. The veterans learned to move carefully, to use periscopes, to never establish patterns. The new recruits learned or died. Poison gas, which would later become synonymous with the Western Front, had not yet been deployed in December 1914, though both sides were experimenting with chemical weapons. The true horrors, chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, would come later, adding another dimension to the nightmare. For now, the war remained almost conventional. Bullets, shells, bayonets, the old tools of killing refined to industrial efficiency. Into this context, the idea of a Christmas truce seemed impossibly naive. Military discipline demanded obedience, separation from the enemy, maintenance of combat readiness. Fraternization with enemy forces could result in court-martial. Officers on both sides had issued orders forbidding contact with the enemy except through violence. The machine of war, once set in motion, was designed to be unstoppable. But machines, even military ones, are operated by humans. And humans, even in war, remain capable of unpredictable grace. The singing continued as morning light strengthened, burning off some of the fog. Hartley remained at his position, rifle ready but unfired, watching the German lines with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Around him, other soldiers had gathered, drawn by the music, the lights, the sheer strangeness of it all. "What do you make of it?" Jenkins asked, voice low. "Could be a trick," Davies replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "Drawing us out so their snipers can pick us off." "They're singing carols," Hartley said. "Not exactly typical sniper bait." The German voices swelled, more soldiers joining in, creating harmonies that carried clearly across no man's land. When Still Nacht ended, they began another, O Tannenbaum, then another. The music was remarkably good. Someone over there had trained voices, or perhaps many someones. The beauty of it seemed obscene in this place of death, yet also necessary, a reminder that beauty still existed. Private Henderson, a young soldier from Liverpool, began humming along. Then, tentatively, he added words. O Christmas tree, how lovely are thy branches." Others joined him. Within moments, the British trench was singing, voices rough and untrained but earnest, responding to the Germans' carols with their own. The sound built, two armies singing at each other, the music replacing the usual exchange of bullets and shells. At 08:15, Lieutenant Crawford arrived at Hartley's section, moving along the trench with quick, nervous steps. He was 24, a recent graduate of Sandhurst, keen to prove himself but uncertain how to handle this situation. His orders were clear: maintain combat readiness, allow no fraternization, prepare for possible enemy attack. But his orders said nothing about Christmas carols. "What's the meaning of this?" Crawford demanded, though quietly, as if afraid the Germans might hear and take offense. "They started singing, sir," Davies explained. We're just responding. This is highly irregular. Crawford peered over the sandbags, scanning the German position. Could be a distraction. They might be moving troops into position for an assault. With respect, sir, Hartley said, I don't think men planning an assault would be singing Silent Night and lighting candles. Crawford frowned, trapped between doctrine and reality. Nevertheless, remain alert. If they show any sign of aggression, you're to open fire immediately. Oh, yes, sir. Crawford moved on, issuing the same orders to other sections, but Hartley could see the confusion in his posture, the way he kept glancing back at the German lines as if expecting them to make sense of this for him. By mid-morning, the singing had mostly stopped, replaced by an odd silence punctuated by occasional shouts. German voices called across no man's land in accented English. "Merry Christmas, Tommy," the British responded in kind, some attempting German phrases learned from signs or prisoners. Frohe Weihnachten. Then came the gifts. Around 11:00, a soldier in the German trench, Hartley couldn't see clearly enough to identify him, stood up, fully exposed, holding something above his head. Every British rifle swung to cover him, fingers on triggers, but no one fired. The German was holding what looked like a small evergreen tree decorated with candles and bits of colored paper. He shouted something in German, then tried English. "Christmas tree for you." He set the tree on the parapet of his trench, clearly visible, then ducked back down. A moment later, another soldier stood, holding a second tree, repeating the gesture. Then another. Soon, the German trench line was dotted with small Christmas trees, a surreal decorative touch to the wasteland. "They're mad," Jenkins whispered, but he was smiling. "Maybe," Hartley replied, "but it's a nice kind of mad." The British soldiers responded organically, without orders. Someone produced a tin of biscuits and waved it above the trench. Someone else held up a bottle, rum probably, or whiskey. Shouts of acknowledgement came from the German side. The informal exchange of goodwill continued, items displayed but not yet delivered, the distance between the trenches still too great, too dangerous. Then came the first major test. At noon, a ration party was supposed to arrive from the reserve trenches, bringing food and mail. The men waited, stomachs growling, hoping for something hot, something fresh. But at 12:30, with still no sign of the rations, Davies cursed under his breath. Typical, one day we'd actually want them on time and they're late. "Could send someone back to check," Jenkins suggested. "No," Davies said firmly, "we're not to leave positions without orders." But the issue was resolved when the rations finally arrived at 13:00, carried by men whose faces showed amazement. "You won't believe what we just saw," one of them said, setting down his load. In the 14th Battalion section, Germans came out of their trenches, just walked out into no man's land, and our lads went out to meet them. They're shaking hands, talking, trading stuff. The news spread through the trench like electricity. Hartley and Davies exchanged glances. If it was happening elsewhere, perhaps. "Sir," Davies called to Lieutenant Crawford, who'd returned to their section. "Permission to speak." Crawford looked harried, overwhelmed. "What is it, Corporal?" "The men are wondering, sir. If other sections are meeting the Germans, might we be permitted to do the same?" "Absolutely not," Crawford said immediately. "Such actions violate orders and could compromise our defensive position." But even as he spoke, his conviction seemed to waver. "I'll need to consult with the captain. In the meantime, maintain your positions." He hurried off, leaving the men in a state of anxious anticipation. The singing had resumed, both sides trading carols like friendly fire. The sun had emerged, weak but welcome, transforming the frost-covered no man's land into something almost beautiful, the barbed wire glittering like strange jewelry. At 14:00, something happened that changed everything. A single German soldier stood up in his trench, not 50 meters from Hartley's position. He was young, perhaps Jenkins's age, wearing a gray uniform and a soft cap. He held no weapon. For a long moment he simply stood there, exposed, vulnerable, looking toward the British line. Then very deliberately, he raised both hands above his head in a gesture of peace and began walking forward into no man's land. Every British soldier in the section brought weapons to bear. Hartley's finger curled around his trigger, heart hammering. This was it, the moment of decision: fire or hold, kill or let live. The German kept walking, slowly, carefully, picking his way between shell craters and wire, hands still raised. He was 20 meters into no man's land when he stopped and called out in careful English, "I wish to speak. No shooting, please, I wish only to speak." Davies looked at Crawford, who'd reappeared at the shout. The lieutenant's face was pale, indecisive. "Sir," Davies prompted. Crawford swallowed hard. Then, surprising everyone, he climbed onto the fire step and shouted back, "Stay where you are, don't come closer." The German soldier stopped, nodded. "I understand, I only wish to say it is Christmas, we are tired of war, can we not have peace just for today, just for Christmas?" The simplicity of it, the earnestness in his voice, struck something deep. Hartley felt his throat tighten. Around him, soldiers lowered their weapons fractionally, waiting. Crawford looked back at his men, seeing their faces, their hope. He looked at the German soldier standing alone in no man's land at the mercy of British guns. He looked at the Christmas trees dotting the enemy trench, at the winter sun breaking through clouds, at the waste and futility of 4 months fighting. "Hold your fire," he said quietly, then louder, "Hold your fires." He turned back to the German soldier and in a voice that shook only slightly called out, "Very well, a truce, just for today." The German soldier's face broke into a wide smile. He waved back toward his trench and more soldiers began standing up, climbing out, moving forward. Simultaneously, without orders, British soldiers began doing the same, scrambling over sandbags, dropping into the crater-pocked wasteland, walking toward the center. Hartley found himself moving, rifle left behind, walking through the gap in the wire, feet crunching on frozen mud. Jenkins was beside him, Davies too. Ahead, German soldiers approached, similarly unarmed, similarly cautious, similarly hopeful. The two groups met in the middle of no man's land, in a place that should have been a killing ground but was, for this moment, neutral territory. A German Oberjefreiter, Friedrich Weber, though Hartley didn't know his name, extended his hand. Hartley, after only a brief hesitation, shook it. "Frohe Weihnachten," Weber said, smiling. "Merry Christmas," Hartley replied. And just like that, the war paused. The moment of contact lasted 3 seconds, 5, 10. Hartley counted them unconsciously, expecting any instant for the spell to break, for shots to ring out from some officer or soldier who couldn't accept this impossible pause. But the seconds stretched into a minute, and the minute held, and the handshake became real. Weber's grip was firm, his hand as cold as Hartley's own. Up close, the German soldier looked tired, his face hollow-cheeked, dark circles under his eyes. He was clean-shaven though, or had been recently, and his uniform, while mud-spattered, showed signs of care. A human being, Hartley realized with a jolt. Not the faceless enemy of propaganda posters, not the Hun of recruiting speeches, but a man who looked remarkably similar to the British soldiers Hartley lived alongside. "You speak English?" Hartley asked. "A little," Weber replied, his accent thick but comprehensible. "I studied it in school long time ago now," he smiled ruefully. "I forget much." "Your English is better than my German," Hartley said. He had no German at all, beyond a few crude insults learned in the trenches. Around them, more soldiers were meeting, shaking hands, patting shoulders, even embracing. The initial tension was dissolving rapidly, replaced by something Hartley could only describe as relief. Relief at seeing the enemy as human, relief at not having to kill or be killed, relief at this temporary escape from the war's grinding horror. Jenkins had found a young German soldier about his age and was attempting conversation through gestures and broken phrases. Davies stood with a German corporal, both men pulling out photographs, showing pictures of their families, finding common ground in fatherhood. Everywhere Hartley looked, small groups were forming, barriers falling away with startling speed. Lieutenant Crawford remained at the British trench line, watching with visible anxiety but not intervening. On the German side, officers were similarly visible, observing but not stopping their men. Perhaps they too understood that this moment, however irregular, was necessary, a safety valve releasing pressure that had built to dangerous levels. Weber pointed back toward his trench. "Would you like to see? We have schnapps and cookies." "Is that the word, cookies?" "Biscuits," Hartley supplied. "We call them biscuits." "Biscuits," Weber repeated carefully. "Yes, would you come share with us?" Hartley glanced back at Davies, who had noticed the exchange. The corporal gave a small nod, permission, or perhaps just acknowledgement that normal rules no longer applied. "Yes," Hartley said, "I'd like that." They walked together across no man's land, an experience so surreal that Hartley felt almost dreamlike. He'd spent months staring at this ground through periscopes, watching men die trying to cross it, measuring distances for artillery strikes, learning every shell hole and wire obstacle. But he'd never simply walked across it, never moved freely in this space that existed between life and death. The ground was worse than it appeared from the trenches. The shell fire had churned it into a chaos of craters, some filled with frozen water, others with mud that grabbed at boots. Wire obstacles supposedly cleared by bombardment were often intact and had to be carefully navigated. Here and there equipment lay scattered, rifles, helmets, unexploded shells that everyone gave wide berth. And there were bodies partially buried or hidden in craters that everyone politely ignored. The German trench when Hartley reached it was surprisingly well constructed. Deeper than the British trenches, with reinforced walls and duckboards that actually kept feet out of the mud. Small niches had been carved into the walls for personal items, and someone had even built a crude table from ammunition crates. The Christmas trees he'd seen earlier were more elaborate up close, decorated with candles, paper stars, and small ornaments that looked handmade. Weber led him to a dugout where several soldiers had gathered. They looked up as Hartley entered, expressions shifting from surprise to curiosity to welcome. One man, older, with a thick mustache, stood and offered his hand. "Willkommen," he said, then tried English. "Welcome, please sit." They made room on a bench fashioned from planks. Someone produced a bottle of schnapps in small tin cups. The clear liquid burned Hartley's throat, but it was warming and he nodded appreciation. Weber retrieved a tin of what were indeed cookies or biscuits, flat, hard things studded with dried fruit. They were delicious, or perhaps just different from the monotonous British rations. "From home," Weber explained, seeing Hartley's enjoyment. "My mother sent them, she bakes very good." "My mother too," Hartley said, and felt a wave of homesickness so intense it was almost painful. Hans Müller, the baker's son, was part of the group. He spoke no English but communicated through Weber, explaining that he missed his father's bakery, that he hoped to return to it after the war. Hartley, through Weber's translation, described his father's textile mill, the smell of cotton and machine oil, the rhythm of the looms. They were talking past each other in some ways, but the meaning came through, normal lives interrupted, waiting to be resumed. Someone started singing again, softly, and the group joined in. Hartley didn't know the words but hummed along, finding the melody. When the song ended, he taught them Good King Wenceslas, and they attempted the English words with enthusiasm if not accuracy. The laughter that resulted was genuine, shared healing. Meanwhile, in no man's land, more interactions were unfolding. Groups of soldiers had formed spontaneous gatherings, producing whatever luxuries they possessed, tobacco, chocolate, alcohol, and sharing them freely. Someone had found a football, whether British or German, no one could say, and was kicking it around, others joining in casually, not yet organized into a proper game but moving in that direction. Davies had ended up in a conversation with a German lieutenant who spoke excellent English, having studied at Oxford before the war. They discovered they'd both been in Belgium during the retreat from Mons, had perhaps been shooting at each other without knowing it. The lieutenant, whose name was Hoffman, produced a flask of cognac, fine stuff looted from a chateau, and they shared it while discussing the absurdity of war, the incompetence of generals, the shared misery of trench life. "You know," Hoffman said thoughtfully, "we've been ordered to kill each other for months. But sitting here sharing a drink, this feels more natural than war ever did." Davies nodded slowly. "My daughters ask me in their letters what the Germans are like. I never knew how to answer. Now I can tell them, they're fathers and sons, same as us." Jenkins, still with his young German counterpart, had progressed to an impromptu language lesson. The German soldier, whose name sounded like Stefan, was teaching Jenkins to count in German while Jenkins taught him English numbers. They collapsed into laughter when Jenkins mangled the pronunciation of Neunzig so badly it sounded like a sneeze. By 1500, the impromptu gathering had grown to include perhaps 200 men from both sides, spread across a 100-meter stretch of no man's land. The scene was chaotic, joyful, utterly unprecedented. Soldiers traded addresses, promising to write after the war. They exchanged uniform buttons as souvenirs. They showed photographs, shared food, taught each other songs and phrases. The football that had appeared earlier had now attracted serious attention. Someone accounts differ on whether it was British or German, suggested a proper match. The idea spread with infectious enthusiasm. Within minutes, goals were being established using helmets and equipment, teams were forming, and the Christmas truce football match was about to begin. The match began at approximately 15:30, though no one was keeping official time. The ball was battered, partially deflated, but it served. The goals were marked by pairs of helmets set roughly 50 meters apart, the pitch a stretch of frozen mud and cratered earth that would have horrified any proper groundskeeper. But none of that mattered. Hartley found himself playing, though he hadn't played football since school. Weber was on the opposing team. They decided on mixed sides initially, but that proved too confusing, so it became British versus German after all, though the distinction felt more playful than hostile. The teams were uneven, constantly shifting as players wandered off to talk or new ones joined. No one kept score officially, though both sides claimed to be winning. The play was chaotic, enthusiastic, and completely joyful. Men slipped in the mud, crashed into each other, laughed at their own clumsiness. Jenkins, with his farm boy strength, proved surprisingly nimble. Mueller, the baker's son, had quick feet and an accurate kick. Davies played defense, his policeman's instincts serving him well. When someone scored and goals were frequent, given the poor quality of goalkeeping, both sides cheered. Lieutenant Crawford watched from the British trench line, torn between horror at the breach of discipline and something that might have been envy. This wasn't in any manual he'd studied at Sandhurst. There were no protocols for handling spontaneous football matches with the enemy. He'd sent a runner to battalion headquarters hours ago but received no response. In the absence of orders, he decided to simply observe, ready to intervene if the situation turned dangerous. It never did. Around the football match, other activities continued. A German soldier who'd been a barber before the war offered haircuts and soon had a queue of British soldiers waiting their turn. He worked with professional efficiency, using scissors from his pack, chatting in broken English about his shop in Hamburg, his regular customers, his hope to return to that simple, peaceful life. Near one of the Christmas trees, a group had formed around two soldiers, one British, one German, who both played harmonica. They took turns playing melodies, each trying to outdo the other, but the competition was friendly, appreciative. When the British soldier played "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," the German soldiers clapped along. When the German played "Die Wachtem Rhein," the British responded with equal enthusiasm, despite not understanding the words. Food and drink flowed freely. The Germans had better alcohol, schnapps, wine, even some beer, while the British had more tobacco and better chocolate. Trade was brisk and equitable. A German officer produced a camera and began taking photographs, positioning groups of mixed soldiers, capturing this impossible day for posterity. Years later, these photographs would surface in museums and history books, proof that this had actually happened. Weber and Hartley ended up sitting together again, recovering from the football match, sharing a cigarette. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across no man's land, turning the frost golden. It was beautiful, this place that had been only a killing ground. After the war, Weber said, you should visit Munich. It is a beautiful city. I will show you the beer gardens, the museums. You would like it, I think. After the war, Hartley replied, you should come to Manchester. It's not as beautiful as Munich probably, but there's good people. My father would like to meet you. They both knew these were fantasy promises, the kind of things you say to be polite, to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But they also both hoped in some quiet corner of their hearts that perhaps it might actually happen, that they might survive this war and meet again as civilians, as friends. As evening approached, the mood shifted subtly. The reality of their situation was reasserting itself. Officers on both sides were becoming more visible, more insistent. Orders would resume, the war would continue. This pause, however magical, was temporary. The football match wound down naturally, exhaustion and failing light bringing it to a close. Final score was disputed. The British claimed 3-2, the Germans insisted it was 4-3, but no one really cared. They'd played, they'd laughed, they'd been human together. That was enough. Men began drifting back toward their respective trenches, handshakes and backslaps exchanged, addresses confirmed, promises made. Stay safe, they told each other. Survive this. The words were inadequate but sincere. Weber and Hartley clasped hands one final time. I hope I do not have to shoot you tomorrow, Weber said, attempting lightness but unable to quite hide the sadness beneath. I hope you don't either, Hartley replied. I hope we both make it home. Yes, home, Weber smiled, squeezed Hartley's hand once more, then turned and walked back toward the German trenches. Hartley watched him go, this enemy who'd become, however briefly, a friend. Then he too turned, picking his way back across no man's land, past the shell craters and wire, back to the British lines where Davies and Jenkins were waiting. As darkness fell, candles appeared again in both trenches, tiny lights marking the Christmas celebration. Singing resumed, but quieter now, more contemplative. Silent Night drifted across no man's land once more, sung in two languages, creating a harmony that was almost unbearably poignant. At 20:00, Lieutenant Crawford gathered his men. Tomorrow, he said, his voice formal but not unkind, we resume normal operations. What happened today was extraordinary, but it cannot continue, you understand. The men nodded, they understood. The war was larger than any of them, larger than this one day of peace. It would grind on regardless of their wishes, their hopes, their brief moment of humanity. Get some rest, Crawford said, and remember what you saw today. Remember that the enemy are men like us. Remember that when the time comes. Hartley settled into his section of the trench, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the cold, clear sky. Stars were visible, thousands of them, indifferent to the human drama below. He thought about Weber, about Müller, about all the German soldiers he'd met today. Tomorrow they might be trying to kill each other again. But today they'd been friends. He pulled out Mary's last letter, read it again by candlelight. She'd asked if he needed anything. He knew now what he'd write back. I need this war to end. I need to come home. I need to remember that the world has room for peace even in the middle of war. Jenkins was already asleep, snoring softly. Davy sat nearby, writing by candlelight, a letter to his daughters, probably telling them about this Christmas they'd never quite believe. Around them, the trench had settled into its nighttime routine, men sleeping or standing watch, the war temporarily quiet. In the German trenches, similar scenes played out. Weber wrote in his diary, trying to capture the day, knowing his words would never do it justice. Müller cleaned his rifle mechanically, thinking about the British farm boy who'd struggled so earnestly to pronounce German words. Hoffman smoked a cigar, staring across no man's land, wondering what his superiors would say when they heard about today. Christmas Day 1914 was ending. It had been, without question, the strangest Christmas any of them would ever experience. A day when enemies became neighbors, when war paused in the shadow of humanity, when the impossible happened simply because enough men decided it should. The truce would not be repeated on the same scale in subsequent years. High commands on both sides, horrified by the fraternization, would take steps to prevent it, rotating units, scheduling attacks for Christmas, explicitly forbidding any contact with the enemy. The war would grow more bitter, more brutal. Poison gas, tanks, aerial bombardment, new horrors would make the trenches of December 1914 seem almost quaint. But for one day in one place the war stopped. Men chose peace over violence, humanity over hatred, hope over despair. It changed nothing about the war's outcome. It saved no lives in the long run. But it mattered nonetheless because it proved that even in the darkest circumstances, human decency could still flourish. Boxing Day, December 26, 1914, dawned cold and gray. Hartley woke to the sound of distant artillery, the war resuming its normal rhythm. For a moment, wrapped in his blanket, he wondered if yesterday had been a dream. But no, he could see the German Christmas trees still visible on their parapet, could hear Jenkins telling another soldier about the football match, could feel the ache in his legs from running on frozen ground. The orders came down at 0800, delivered by a grim-faced Captain Morrison who'd arrived from battalion headquarters. Normal operations resume immediately. There will be no repetition of yesterday's activities. Any soldier attempting to fraternize with the enemy will face court-martial. Is that understood? Yes, sir, the men responded, but without enthusiasm. Morrison continued, furthermore, you're to prepare for a trench raid tonight. We need to re-establish dominance in no man's land and remind the enemy that we're at war. The raid never happened. No one admitted who fired a shot high over the German trenches at the scheduled time. The Germans responded in kind, shooting high and wide. Both sides maintained the fiction of hostility while carefully avoiding casualties. The officers pretended not to notice. This pattern would continue for several days in some sectors. The Christmas truce had created an unofficial understanding. We'll shoot, but we won't try to hit you. It was a compromise between military necessity and human decency, and it worked until fresh units arrived who hadn't experienced the truce and resumed killing in earnest. Davies received a letter from battalion headquarters 3 days later, marked private and confidential. It was a warning. His participation in the truce had been noted and would be overlooked this once, but any future fraternization would result in serious disciplinary action. He burned the letter after reading it, watching the paper curl and blacken in a small fire, but said nothing to his men. Lieutenant Crawford was quietly transferred to another unit in January, officially described as a routine rotation, but understood by everyone as punishment for allowing the truce to occur. He never spoke about Christmas 1914, never wrote about it in letters home, carried it as a private memory that he'd review late at night, wondering if he'd done the right thing. Jenkins wrote to his mother in early January describing the truce in careful language that wouldn't alarm the censors. "We had a peaceful Christmas day," he wrote. "Met some German soldiers. They were decent fellows, not so different from us. It gave me hope that when this is all over we might learn to live in peace again." His mother saved that letter, kept it in a drawer for the rest of her life. After Jenkins was killed at the Somme in 1916, she would read it sometimes, finding comfort in the knowledge that her son had experienced at least one day of peace, one day when the war paused. Hartley tried to keep track of Weber's unit, asking prisoners and checking captured documents whenever possible, hoping to learn that the German schoolteacher had survived. He never found confirmation either way. After the war, he made inquiries through German veterans organizations but received no response. Friedrich Weber had been swallowed by the war, one of millions whose fate remained unknown. The football used in the Christmas match became something of a legend. Multiple units claimed to possess the original ball from the Christmas truce, though most of these were likely fabrications or false memories. At least one football, now in the Imperial War Museum in London, has a credible provenance linking it to the truce, though the exact sector where it was used remains disputed. Photographs from the day surfaced gradually over the years. Some appeared in German newspapers in the 1920s, others in British publications. The most famous, showing British and German soldiers standing together, smiling at the camera, became iconic, reproduced in countless history books and documentaries. When shown these images, veterans would nod slowly, remembering, sometimes weeping for the lost hope those photographs represented. News of the truce spread quickly through both armies, carried by soldiers rotated out of the line, by letters that slipped past censors, by word of mouth that no official prohibition could stop. The reactions varied. Some soldiers in other sectors attempted their own truces with mixed success. Some officers expressed horror, seeing it as a betrayal of duty. Some civilians, reading about it in newspapers that carried sanitized accounts, felt a surge of hope that perhaps the war might end peacefully. High commands on both sides were indeed horrified, though for different reasons. The British were concerned about discipline and morale. If soldiers could refuse to fight on Christmas, what would stop them from refusing at other times? The Germans worried about propaganda value. What message did it send if their soldiers were seen fraternizing with the enemy? Both issued strict orders forbidding any repetition. In Berlin and London, the truce became a political football. Peace activists seized on it as evidence that the common soldiers wanted peace, that the war was being prolonged by leaders, not the people. Military authorities countered that it was an isolated incident, blown out of proportion, not representative of general sentiment. The debate raged in newspapers, in Parliament, in the Reichstag, but ultimately changed nothing. The war continued. For the soldiers who'd participated, the aftermath was more personal. They'd seen the enemy as human, and that knowledge couldn't be unknown. It made the subsequent fighting harder in some ways, easier in others. Harder because you knew you might be killing someone like Weber, someone with family and dreams and a desire to go home. Easier because the brief humanity had released some pressure, had reminded them what they were fighting to return to. Hartley noticed that the veterans of the Christmas truce were different, more cynical about the war perhaps, but also more determined to survive it. They took fewer unnecessary risks, looked after each other more carefully, maintained hope where others descended into fatalism. The truce had given them something to hold onto, proof that even in hell, heaven could break through, however briefly. By spring 1915, most of the original participants were dead, wounded, or transferred. The war had entered its industrial phase, with battles measured by weeks rather than days, casualties in the hundreds of thousands rather than thousands. The intimate scale of trench warfare gave way to massive offensives that pulverized entire landscapes. The Christmas truce became a story old-timers told new recruits, increasingly embellished, less and less believed. But the story persisted. It passed from soldier to soldier, generation to generation, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming something more important than the factual details could ever be. It became a symbol, proof that humanity could survive even war, that compassion could coexist with conflict, that peace was always possible if enough people chose it. The Christmas truce of 1914 lasted in most places only one day. In some sectors it extended to 2 or 3 days. In a few small gestures of humanity, withholding fire, warning of attacks, allowing burial parties, continued for weeks or even months. But the official war, the organized killing, resumed and would continue for 4 more years, claiming millions more lives. Thomas Hartley survived the war. He was wounded twice at Passchendaele in 1917 and in the final advance in 1918, but lived to return to Manchester, to his father's textile mill, to Mary, who'd waited for him. They married in 1919, had 3 children, lived ordinary lives marked by the extraordinary experiences they'd survived. Hartley never spoke much about the war, but on Christmas Eve he would grow quiet, would stand at the window looking at stars, remembering. William Davies didn't make it home. He was killed by a sniper in March 1915, shot through the head while checking his men's positions. He'd been writing a letter to his daughters when the call came. The letter, unfinished, was sent home with his effects. Elizabeth and Catherine kept it their entire lives, this last message from the father who'd loved them. Robert Jenkins survived until the Somme, July 1916, where he died in the first hour of the first day of that terrible battle, cut down by machine gun fire while advancing across no man's land that was, in its way, no different from the ground he'd crossed peacefully on Christmas 1914. His Bible, still in his pocket, was returned to his mother, who never recovered from his loss. Of the Germans Hartley met that Christmas Day, their fates remain mostly unknown. Friedrich Weber vanished into the war's great darkness. Hans Müller may have been the soldier mentioned in a 1916 report as dying of wounds at Verdun, but the record is unclear. Lieutenant Hoffmann was promoted, survived the war, and later wrote a memoir in which he devoted a single paragraph to the Christmas truce, describing it as a brief moment of sanity in an insane world. In the decades after the war, the Christmas truce became something both more and less than what it had been. Less because no retelling could capture the full emotional complexity of that day, the fear and hope intertwined, the provisional nature of the peace, the knowledge that it would end. More because it came to symbolize something larger than itself. The possibility of peace, the shared humanity that transcends nationality and conflict, the courage it takes to choose compassion over violence. The story has been told in books, films, songs, and plays. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects: the football match, the exchange of gifts, the singing across the trenches. Some versions sentimentalize it, making it too simple, too clean. Others cynically dismiss it as meaningless, a brief pause that changed nothing. The truth, as always, is more complex. The Christmas truce mattered because the men who experienced it said it mattered. In letters, in memoirs, in conversations decades later, they would describe that day with an intensity that suggested it had been one of the most significant of their lives. Not the battles, not the medals or promotions or wounds, but that one day when they chose peace and found it possible. It mattered because it revealed something essential about human nature: that we are not inevitably violent, that war is a choice we can decline, that even in the deepest darkness, light can break through if we allow it. The Christmas truce didn't end the war, didn't prevent future wars, didn't solve the political disputes that had ignited the conflict. But it proved that those disputes, however serious, didn't have to be resolved through killing. That alternatives existed if people were brave enough to choose them. In no man's land on that Christmas Day, something remarkable happened. Enemies became neighbors, if only briefly. Men who'd been trying to kill each other shared food, played football, sang songs, laughed together. They remembered they were human, that the men across from them were human too, that humanity mattered more than the uniforms they wore or the flags they saluted. And then they went back to war, because the forces that had brought them there, nationalism, militarism, politics, economics, all the complex machinery of modern conflict, remained stronger than individual choice. The war continued, as wars do, grinding up men and nations with impartial efficiency. The peace couldn't last because it was unsupported by the structures of power that governed their world. But for one cold Christmas, enemies became neighbors, and for a moment, war paused in the shadow of humanity. That moment, brief as it was, echoes still across the decades. It reminds us that peace is always possible, that humanity can always choose compassion, that even in the darkest times, hope can survive. The Christmas truce of 1914 was not a solution to war. It was an answer to despair. And in a world that still struggles with conflict, that still allows politics and prejudice to divide us, that answer remains as relevant as ever. We are all human, we all want peace, and when we choose to see each other clearly, past the divisions and the propaganda and the fear, we can find our common ground. The soldiers who met in no man's land that Christmas knew this. They'd lived through months of horror, would face more horror ahead, but they'd also experienced something rare and precious, a moment when the better angels of human nature prevailed. They carried that moment through the rest of the war, through the rest of their lives, as proof that peace is possible, that humanity endures, that hope is never completely lost. For one cold Christmas, enemies became neighbors, and for that moment the world was as it should be.